The A-62M went to war in China in 1940. Here it came up against fighters of the American Volunteer Group, which sent full reports on the new plane home to Washington. The information was ignored, however, and the Zeros came as a terrible shock to the Americans when they swept down on Pearl Harbor a year later. It was clear that the Japanese possessed not only the world's finest carrier-launched fighter, but one which could equal the best land-based planes as well. Like most Japanese military aircraft, the Zero suffered in the long run because refinements such as armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks had been sacrificed for speed, range, and maneuverability. But in the first months of the Pacific War, no Allied fighter of this time could match it, and bombers were helpless in its gun sights. The next Zero was the A6M3 model, with both squared-off wingtips and a more powerful 1,130 horsepower engine. Top speed was now 336 miles per hour, but the Zero was still no match for superior Allied fighters. It fell easy prey to aircraft such as the Lockheed P-38. Despite later improvements in range and fuel capacity, by the autumn of 1942, it was clear that the Zero was beginning to lose its early lead in the air war. To remedy this situation, Mitsubishi introduced the A6M5 Zero in 1943. This was basically an M3 with rounded wingtips. Armor protection was added for the pilot's benefit. The plane was also equipped with heavier caliber machine guns to fight off the enemy. The Zero's flimsy construction and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks could make it a death trap, as American gun camera shots show. A single half-second burst from a U.S. Navy Hellcat or Corsair could send a Zero plunging in flames. Still, in the hands of a skilled pilot, the Zero could often evade the more powerful and more heavily armed American fighters. On one occasion, the great Japanese fighter ace, Saburo Sakai, found himself alone in a dogfight with no less than 15 Hellcats. Rolling, spiraling, and looping, he evaded the fire from 90 machine guns and brought his Zero home without a scratch. As the war raged on, Mitsubishi developed other models to follow the early production Zeros. The M7 model was a dive bomber, and the M8, which had a 1,500 horsepower engine, arrived too late to have any effect on the course of the war. By this time, most of the skilled veterans of Japan's early war years had found watery graves. Their young replacements were either unable to cope in combat against superior aircraft or were thrown away in kamikaze attacks on Allied warships. One irony in the Zero story is that it was powered throughout by air-cooled radial engines. Radials, although not as popular with designers as the German and British inline engines, gave better performance at low altitudes, where most aerial battles took place. Even though the Zero was eventually outclassed by its Allied opponents, it was in many ways a fighter ahead of its time. At the beginning of the war, Zeros racked up so many kills that the Allies thought there were twice as many than there actually were. The futuristic and menacing-looking Messerschmitt 210 was one of the most disastrously unsuccessful fighters of the entire war. It led to Willy Messerschmitt being forced to resign as chairman of his own company, and even caused Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, to exclaim that Messerschmitt would have lived longer if the aircraft had never been produced. The 210 was designed in 1937 as a twin-engine multi-purpose fighter and attack aircraft to replace the Messerschmitt 110. Its handling qualities were appalling, and there were numerous crashes resulting from uncontrollable spins. The pair of remotely controlled 13mm machine guns mounted at the rear of the fuselage could be adjusted to fire at almost any angle, but they were almost impossible to aim and often didn't even work. Most of the time, crews simply ignored them. The doors under the nose, designed to carry bombs or cameras, caused such instability that only a suicidal crew would open them during a flight. Another problem was the complex arrangement of ailerons, flaps, and dive brakes, which were intended to help the pilot. In reality, they only made the 210 even more unstable, with a vicious tendency to flick into a spin. Some of these handling problems were eventually solved by adding wing leading edge slots and lengthening the fuselage. But these changes were not introduced until production had already been halted in 1942. The Messerschmitt 210 was powered by two 1,050 or 1,350 horsepower Daimler-Benz 601 inline engines, which gave a top speed of almost 400 miles per hour. Apart from the machine guns on the rear fuselage, it also had two forward-firing 20mm cannon and yet another pair of forward machine guns. Extra bombs could also be carried on external racks. Ironically enough, the Luftwaffe was so impressed with the design specifications of the 210 that they ordered 1,000 even before the aircraft first flew. Little did they realize that the 210's performance would fall so short of its potential. Of the 1,000 ordered, only 352 actually made it out of production. The Messerschmitt 210 only flew limited missions over Russia, England, Italy, and Tunisia before the aircraft was judged unsuitable for combat. Most Me-210s were converted to the modified 410 version. The Me-410 looked like a late model 210, but it had more powerful engines and was more forgiving in the air. In total, some 1,100 Messerschmitt 410s were produced. Several versions, including fighters, light bombers, and photo reconnaissance aircraft, were developed, but many of these were never built. Like the 210, the Me-410 played only a minor role in the war, and the program was finally abandoned in 1944. If the Messerschmitt 210 was the German Air Force's disaster story, the Focke-Wulf 190 was its greatest success story. It was the finest single-seat, single-engine fighter flown by the Luftwaffe. Although the sheer number of Messerschmitt 109s produced was greater, the Focke-Wulf 190 was really the German fighter from the autumn of 1941 onwards. Design work began in 1937, and the first prototype flew in June 1939. Kurt Tank, the 190's designer, was heavily influenced by the layout of the American Hughes Racer, which set an impressive speed record in the United States. The Me-190 incorporated many of its features, including a slim fuselage, small wings, tall tail, and wide-track landing gear. The choice of an air-cooled BMW radial engine for the 190 surprised many people at a time when streamlined, liquid-cooled inlines were more popular, but it proved a wise choice. Most of the successful Allied fighters in the second half of the war were powered by radial instead of inline engines. Radials gave better performance at lower heights, where most of the encounters with other aircraft took place. They were also bulky, but the 190's engine was enclosed in a narrow cord cowling, which helped reduce drag, and the engine had a cooling fan at the rear.